And take it away.
Okay, so this is the third class in the series of classes relative to American history. And what I've done is I've broken out the 24 things that I think someone needs to know to understand American history. And each class, individual class, was to explain each one of those items that I think are essential. We're now down to the final four that I think are essential for understanding American history. And mind you, what I'm presenting is the results of my research as a security person in trying to resolve the discrepancy between America as that shining light on a hill, freedom, justice, good guys, and a world that did not look at us that way, that saw us as brutes, as slave masters, as invaders and occupiers. So what I was looking to do was, how do I reconcile that? What happened? Which is right? Which is wrong? And in researching it, I come to find a history of America that I certainly did not learn in grammar school and high school. It's only in the post years that I got to read the work of real academic historians, not the stuff that's written in textbooks, but the things that have been researched and revealed to us, really beginning in the 1960s and on out. So that painted a very different picture, which is why these are the things that I see as the 24 that are the most important. So we will begin with the Louisiana Purchase. Next week, we'll talk about the railroads. Then we're going to talk about how England outlawed slavery. And that act becomes a primary pillar of the causes of the Civil War. And then I'll conclude by making my argument that the Confederacy indeed wins the war. And so let's talk about the Louisiana Purchase. And this is after the American Revolution. Mind you, England, France, Spain never thought that this new country was going to survive. They didn't think much of the revolutionaries in the first place. England recognized that it lost that war because it could not put the effort into that war. It was distracted with other things that were in the West Indies, in China, and in India, that were of greater importance to England than the North American colonies. So they had suspected that they would crumble sooner or later. And England maintained relations with the Native Americans. The thought there was that they might rise up and crush these revolutionaries and disrupt this new country. What happens is, remember, we talked about the French and Indian War and how it created financial problems for both England and France at the end of that war. And for England, it meant the proclamation line, which was going to be, colonists don't go across this line because we can't afford another Indian War. For the French, who also experienced financial strains because of the French-Indian War, that financial condition caused great distress at home, ultimately erupting in the French Revolution. Out of the French Revolution, Napoleon comes to power. And Napoleon is just another emperor who's looking to flex his muscle and create more empire. And he has a problem that occurs in Haiti. This is the one successful slave revolution, and there's the white power structures, not only in France, but all, England and Spain and the others. really wanted to see Haiti crushed because they didn't want to give encouragement to other slaves. And so, but Napoleon, these wars cost money. So Napoleon is in need of cash, and he decides he's going to sell Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory. Now, of course, what gave him the right, or France the right, to claim this territory as being owned by the French is, something that we need to consider, because really the root of that was the doctrine of discovery, which we talked about way back. Anyway, so he decides he wants to do that. Now, Thomas Jefferson is a guy who, he remember the Articles of Confederation were joining the colonists together to fight against England, but they didn't really want to come together. They didn't like each other. They didn't want anything to do with each other. They wanted to keep their own rights, independence from each other. That causes a problem. They ultimately take what was the Constitution at that time, the Articles of Confederation, and they tear it up and throw it out and start over again with a new Constitution. However, Jefferson and others want to continue states' rights. We have to come together because we have debts, we have to pay them, but let's not get too close here. So Jefferson is one of the advocates for states' rights. He's against federalism. He is a Republican meaning that we're joined together in this republic, but we're independent of each other. However, and he doesn't want a king. The president isn't supposed to be a king. He doesn't raise a problem when George Washington is in power, but when John Adams is in power and Jefferson is the vice president, he then has a lot of problems about the executive having too much power. So he now is confronted by Napoleon with a deal. We will sell you Louisiana for a pittance. But following the Constitution, Jefferson doesn't really have the authority to do that. He needs congressional and Senate, the House and the Senate to approve that kind of thing, because they're the people who allot money, right? And so he doesn't have any of that, but he goes ahead and he makes the deal with Napoleon. And that opens a path that will unleash the American assault on the Native Americans. It reaches new heights in this period, and very significant in stealing Indian lands, in taking lands that are rich, fertile soil, and then having to get the enslaved population to shift into this new area to extrapolate that wealth and that power. And so this is very similar to what existed before the revolution. It's what's existing after the revolution, which, as I argue, is that there was no revolution. It was merely secession. For the peoples who had migrated to those lands 20,000 years ago, mind you, the European invasion comes with Columbus in 1492, but these peoples have occupied these lands for 20,000 years. Today, of course, we call them illegal immigrants. They are the only legal people here. If you have a sense of justice and righteousness and morality, they did not invade. They migrated based on nature sending them here. The Europeans, beginning with Columbus, invaded lands that were occupied. That's the distinction. And so it opens the door for the invaders to now spread further, which is going to mean rape, murder, and plunder, and the perpetration of genocide against the indigenous peoples. And for the enslaved people from the African continent, the Louisiana Purchase opened a path to what becomes the darkest point in the history of slavery, and that is the cotton plantation South. Settler colonialism was already underway. We had a class about settler colonialism. Squatters and speculators continued encroaching upon French lands and Spanish territories that were claimed under the doctrine of discovery. The English colonists remained, who after the American Revolution, these English colonists who are now pushing into the West, further west, past the Proclamation line, their loyalties are up for bid. So they're not, they're not so much tied to this new United States of America. They'll do a deal with the Spanish or the English, and so they are negotiating those kinds of things. Colonists, they're prepared to cast their fate with Spain, France, the United States, based on whoever it is going to meet their needs. Let's take a look at, get the right one here. Where did it go? Here it is. Share that. Okay. Hopefully I have this right.
At the dawn of the 19th century, a restless America looked to the West. The population of this young country, some 5.5 million people, needed room to grow. They got their wish on April 30th, 1803, when America was suddenly transformed from 17 states and the Western territories to a nation nearly double in size. Roughly 828,000 square miles came its way literally overnight. This was the Louisiana Purchase, a territory that would eventually become 6 states as well as portions of 9 more. The price? $15 million, or about 4 cents an acre. Today, this land seems like a fixture on the map, but in fact, the United States acquired the territory thanks to countless factors that were beyond its control. Factors like the court intrigues of the Spanish crown, the boundless ego of Napoleon, unexpected ice storms, and the uncertain fate of a small Caribbean island. The future of America rode on the sheer whims of fortune.
The Louisiana Purchase, when we look back at it from 200 years, is taken to be something that just was inevitable and that it was meant to happen. But in fact, it was the product of so many contingent events, any one of which could have gone wrong and derailed the whole thing.
The Louisiana Purchase was a tremendous accident, very much a fortuitous event, and not at all what they were thinking about, the people who were running the government at this time. They did not want the Louisiana Purchase. It's not an inevitability. It was an accident.
Real, live, flesh and blood human beings have to make decisions. Sometimes they're made on instinct, sometimes they're made because of passion, but still it's a decision that leads to events unfolding. And in this case, the Louisiana Purchase story reminds us that history is not inevitable.
In fact, that Louisiana, of all places, would set the stage for so much drama is unlikely enough. In 1682, the French explorer La Salle claims it and names it for King Louis XIV. But for nearly 100 years, it's considered worthless. It remains largely uncharted, a vast, impenetrable wilderness populated by Native Americans and a few scattered French military outposts and settlements. After the French and Indian War in 1762, France pawns Louisiana off on its ally Spain as a token of gratitude. Louis XV of France even offers his apologies for it being such a measly gift.
Louisiana is a swampy land filled with savages and some ne'er-do-wells with no significant commercial benefits, and it costs more to take care of it than the profits that they get from it. So France decides to give Louisiana to Spain as a kind of a sop for the fact that Spain had come to France's aid in the war. It's a token, it's a game piece in European diplomacy.
Spain's King Carlos III almost declines the offer, but then decides his new acquisition may be useful after all, as a buffer zone for his precious silver mines in Mexico.
From that perspective, for Spain, it was perfectly satisfactory as Louisiana sort of maintained itself as an empty place because it worked. You know, it was a no man's land, if you will.
The invaders Carlos fears most are the British. But after the Revolutionary War, Spain confronts a new threat.
The Americans are seen as a very dynamic, very aggressive people. They're very much a land-hungry people. They're commercially active. They're having big families, reproducing and growing in population very quickly. And the Spanish understand that a dynamic neighbor, American neighbor, is a threat to them.
As America's population is growing, settlers are spreading across the Appalachian Mountains, through the western frontier territories of what are now West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Within 14 years of the Revolution, the population there will more than triple to over 160,000. They're settling along the Mississippi and spreading into Spanish Louisiana.
And as those numbers of people continue to grow, the Spanish officials in New Orleans are just, they're kind of looking upriver. And I mean, you know, my God, they could overrun us, you know, in a minute if they chose to. And in fact, they could.
What draws the settlers ever closer to the Spanish is the economic importance of the Mississippi River itself. In the early 1780s, nearly half of America's produce comes from frontier farms. To ship their goods back east to the seaboard states, the settlers have two options: take the difficult journey overland, or simply slip their goods down the Mississippi and its tributaries and out to the open sea. The Mississippi's waters are the lifeblood of America's commerce.
They would load up their barrels of flour and corn and whiskey or whatever they had made on flatboats or rafts and send them down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. But then you had to ship them onto an ocean-going vessel. And so you need to have a place, a port with warehouse facilities where big ocean-going ships can pull in.
That port city is New Orleans, and who controls it is becoming increasingly important. The Spanish hope that by securing the port, they can discourage Americans from spilling across their border. So, in 1784, they closed the lower Mississippi to foreigners. The Americans out west are enraged.
There was a sentiment there that we're being abandoned by our own government. They're not securing our most basic rights, and so maybe we should look around and see what sort of deal we can get from the Spanish.
In settlements throughout the territory of Kentucky, frontiersmen threatened to break away from the Union. They'd rather become colonists of Spain so their goods could pass through New Orleans.
Get this. And so so Jefferson now is faced with the ability to purchase this land from Napoleon, and with some intrigue, he pulls it off. Oh, what just happened there? Sorry, something went wrong there. I'll get that right. Okay, let me open this disk. Sorry, I opened this that wasn't supposed to.
Corporate funding for this program was provided by General Motors. Whether it's building cars and trucks or supporting public television programs like this one, General Motors is in the business of helping people go where they want to go. Major funding was also provided by the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by annual financial support from viewers like you. Additional support was provided by Virginia Tourism and its driving tour of Jefferson's, Virginia.
Sal, what are we supposed to be seeing?
Hang on. I made a mistake and I'm trying to get it reconnected. So hang with me for a second here.
No worries.
Oh.
Corporate funding for this program was provided by General Motors. Whether it's building cars and trucks or supporting public television programs like this one, General Motors is in the business of helping people go where they want to go. Major funding was also provided by the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by annual financial support from viewers like you. Additional support was provided by Virginia Tourism and its driving tour of Jefferson's, Virginia.
July 5th, 1803, Washington. Yesterday was a day of joy to our citizens and of pride to our president. The news of the cession of Louisiana only arrived about 8 o'clock of the night preceding. This mighty event forms an era in our history, and of itself must render the administration of Jefferson immortal.
In 1803, Jefferson bought Louisiana, the vast territory between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, from France for $15 million. It was a sum nearly twice the federal budget. Though Congress had not authorized that amount, and his enemies accused him of abusing the Constitution's powers, Jefferson agreed to pay it. It was the greatest land deal in history.
The Louisiana Purchase is, in a sense, the making moment of American history. Because by buying Louisiana, Jefferson not only doubled the size of the country with a single stroke of the pen, I mean, it was unprecedented in human history to buy an empire. But by buying this territory, he essentially removed Britain, France, Russia, and Spain from serious contention on this continent.
Even before Jefferson bought Louisiana, he had quietly fitted out a government expedition to explore it, headed by two young Army officers, his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark, the brother of a Revolutionary hero. He called the expedition the Corps of Discovery.
Jefferson loved the notion of discovery. He loved the idea that this continent was a treasure house of the unprecedented, and we were going to describe it and fall in love with it. But behind the facade of the philosophe inventorying the West, Jefferson was a quite shrewd geopolitician, and he was able to give different messages to different constituents to enable what for him was partly a practical matter of making sure that this continent was going to belong to us, and then secondarily, and more interestingly, his Enlightenment program, which was to say, let's go see if the woolly mammoth is still roaming on the Great Plains somewhere. What does the source of the Missouri really look like? What kinds of Indians are those, and what can they teach us about human relations?
From the newest section of the nation, Lewis and Clark sent him boxes full of their discoveries. Animal skeletons and buffalo robes, maps and mineral samples. Jefferson planted Indian corn from the Great Plains on his farm and proudly displayed elk antlers in his front hall at Monticello.
However, our present interests may restrain us within our own limits. It is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole continent with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar forms, and by similar laws.
But despite his lifelong interest in native culture, Jefferson believed that white settlement was more important and encouraged the removal of nearly all the Eastern Indians from their homelands to the West.
And so I just think that's when we contemplate what we have in the current day of, just bullying your way through things. I mean, it's not that different than what we had with the founding fathers. The Indians are invisible to them. They simply don't exist. And so you have, and what he's operating under the discovery. He's going to send Lewis and Clark out to discover what? Lands that are inhabited by other people. Again, it is invasion, it is occupation, and it is genocidal is what gets perpetrated against the Native Americans. Napoleon it wants to make this deal because Napoleon he has to crush this rebellion in Haiti, and he gets involved in a war that becomes France's first Vietnam. Mind you, just for interest, is that the war in Vietnam begins in 1858, when Napoleon III invaded Vietnam. But the Vietnamese, I suppose, took their lessons from the Haitians, which was, we will fight you to the death to get you out of here. And they continued that fight beginning in 1858 until they threw out the Americans in 1975. Let's have a look at Haiti.
When Thomas Jefferson heard that French ships had arrived in Santo Domingo, he was the first to suspect that this was a mere rehearsal for the subsequent planting of a French empire in Louisiana and the United States. In Santo Domingo, the flower of the French infantry had wilted, enervated by heat and malaria, baffled by natives on their own terrain, and they were led by a black general, Toussaint Louverture, a master of guerrilla warfare, which was a furtive military type quite beyond the talent of the portrait painters of the day to represent. The upshot was that Napoleon lost 24,000 of his finest soldiers. Santo Domingo was, in fact, his Vietnam. He withdrew and decided against any other adventures 3,000 miles from home. So he sold Louisiana freehold, and the territorial transfer was signed right here in this room in the Cabildo in New Orleans. And it was all kept so secret that only 20 days elapsed between the knowledge that Louisiana had passed from Spain to France and then that the Americans had bought it. And the very day the people gathered in the square outside here to celebrate the fact that they were becoming Frenchmen, they were suddenly Americans. A confusion of what today I suppose we'd call identity that seems to cause no pain at all. I think this bust in the Cabildo ought to be inscribed, Thomas Jefferson chuckled here. Because you see, a president can only conclude a treaty with a foreign nation with the advice and consent of the Senate. Jefferson advised and consented with nobody. He didn't mention a word of the whole Louisiana Purchase till it was finished. And his comment on why he kept it secret is a wonderfully barefaced bit of gall worthy of Franklin Roosevelt at his blandest. Listen to this. This treaty must, of course, be laid before both houses. Both, I presume, will see their duty to their country in ratifying and paying for it. The executive, I grant, has done an act beyond the Constitution, but it is the case of a guardian investing the money of his ward in purchasing an important adjacent territory and saying to him when of age, I did this for your good. Of course, it was unconstitutional, it was outrageous. But in the end, even Jefferson's enemies accepted it. For the most reliable of American reasons, it worked. Clinching the smoothest deal in the history of real estate, Jefferson had doubled the existing territory of the United States for the price of a Miami Beach hotel. $16 million, or 4 cents an acre. Jefferson decided at once to measure and survey it with a military expedition led by his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and an old soldier buddy of his, William Clark. Like stout Cortez, they picked up an Indian girl, a 16-year-old Shoshone named Sacagawea, who, with her French-Canadian husband, would be guide, interpreter, and go-between. In the one really threatening encounter with the Indians, she got between Lewis and the menacing chief, who, astoundingly, turned out to be her brother. Jefferson's orders were, as always, crisp and all-embracing. They were to open up a river route for a continental fur trade, to study the Indian tribes, their languages and customs, to be nice to them on all occasions, but to convey the message that they now belonged to the great white father back in Washington.
The great white father. Let me get this next one up. So, 6. And so let's look at how the Native Americans think of the Great White Father.
When we passed through the country between Pittsburgh and our nations, lately Shawnee and Lenape hunting grounds, where we could once see nothing but deer and buffalo, we found the country thickly inhabited and the people under arms. We were compelled to make a detour of 300 miles. We saw large numbers of white men in forts and fortifications around Salt Springs and buffalo grounds. Cornstalk, Shawnee.
In the aftermath of the American Revolution, the lands of the powerful Haudenosaunee nations were shrunk to little more than reservation islands. The front lines of the invasion moved west to the nations of the Ohio Valley, the Lenape, Shawnee, Miami, and others. Settlers flooded west, many of them Revolutionary War veterans paid with land grants by the government left bankrupt from the war. Supported by the new United States, they came prepared to fight for the land.
The people of our frontier carry on private expeditions against the Indians and kill them whenever they meet them. And I do not believe there is a jury in all Kentucky who would punish a man for it. John Hamtramck, Major, United States Army.
And so when they expand into the West, what they find is rich, fertile soil, and it coincides with the Industrial Revolution that is taking place in England. England has a demand for cotton, and the soil of Mississippi is good for growing cotton.
Slavery transforms America into an economic power. That made slaves the most valuable thing in the making.
And so let's get to our next one. Okay, Lauren?
Yes.
Slaves in the field?
Yes.
Decades before Harriet Jacobs was born, leading Southerners such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had been convinced that slavery was nearing its end. Tobacco had exhausted the soil. The need for slave labor had diminished. That changed in 1803 when President Jefferson signed the Louisiana Purchase and doubled the size of the nation. 4 new states, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, together known as the Deep South, joined the Union as slave states.
Thomas Jefferson, in negotiating the Louisiana Purchase, declared that he was going to create an empire for liberty. He was going to make an area in which American liberty would expand across the continent. Thomas Jefferson's empire for liberty turned out to be an empire for slavery. The 19th century, the years after Louisiana Purchase, were the period of the greatest expansion of American slavery ever.
The new land was an ideal match for a new invention, the cotton gin.
The combination of the cotton gin and the Louisiana Purchase made the production of cotton unbelievably profitable. You know, the cotton gin increased the amount of cotton that a single slave could produce in a day by 50-fold. What it meant was that growing cotton was incredibly, incredibly profitable.
In 1808, just as cotton was creating an insatiable appetite for slave labor, Congress abolished the importation of slaves from Africa. Now an already vibrant domestic slave trade would flourish.
And that domestic slave trade consisted of slaves taken from Virginia and sold into slavery in what becomes, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and the domestic slave trade is robust. People are snatched off of farms in Virginia, separated from their families, and they are walked south. They are walked south. They're in chains, and but they're taken by the Georgia men, and they are taken into New Orleans, where they are then auctioned off for sale. Get my next one up. Bear with me a second here. That one can come down. This is
I've spent much of my life searching for the stories of the African American people.
sorry.
Our first notation with Anthony Johnson essentially defines him as Antonio the Negro. Wanted to tell their history.
Okay, so it's episode 2. All right. More time. We'll get it. Sorry. This will eventually work again. Let me get that up.
In many ways,
Okay, so the cotton plantation South, which is facilitated by the Louisiana Purchase, cotton being in demand in England, this becomes the money maker for America. One of the best books is The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of Modern Day Capitalism. America's system of capitalism is born in the cotton plantation South. It's a very important part of the story.
Second Middle Passage was just as devastating as the first. To feed King Cotton, more than 1 million African Americans were carried off into the Deep South. That's 2.5 times the number that were brought to the United States from Africa. It was the largest forced migration in American history. And it filled the countryside with a haunting sight. Slaves chained together, marching south.
You'd hear the clanking of the chains as the enslaved people walk through here.
Like a prison gang.
Exactly, exactly. The men usually were in front, and they were always chained by the necks and by the wrists. Women weren't always chained, but sometimes they were. I always tell people to think about the 5 senses when you talk about slavery. So what do you hear, what do you think, what do you taste, what do you smell? You'll hear weeping and sobbing and wailing. And oftentimes when families were separated, you'll have enslaved narratives talk about how they heard their mothers screaming up until the distance, until the wagon was gone, you know, or even when the wagon was gone, they could still hear the screams from the mothers.
Do you have nightmares about it? Do you dream about it?
Yes, yes. It's the stories about women and being raped. Here they are walking 200-300 miles journey, tired. Then at night they were being raped. I can't imagine the kind of shame that enslaved people felt. And if there was a partner around, to have to witness that, somebody putting their hands on their partner like that must have been really difficult.
Must have been a nightmare.
Yeah.
The Second Middle Passage lasted roughly 70 years, from 1790 right up to the Civil War. For Black people in the South, that meant 70 years of near constant upheaval. Slave families that had been stable for generations were suddenly and irrevocably shattered.
Every time somebody was sold, people would come out of the fields to say goodbye to the people who were leaving. And they had certain hymns that they would sing about seeing each other again in heaven. And so that music and paying homage to those people was really a way of saying they did have bonds, and that when those were being broken, they had to have some kind of way of saying goodbye.
Look down, look down, that long, long farm road, where you and I must go.
The rise of cotton affected every African American, even those who were free. This was especially true for the free Black people who remained in the South, struggling to build lives within a slave economy. Some made decisions that are difficult for us to understand today. This cemetery holds the remains of the Brown Fellowship Society, an elite organization of free Black men in Charleston, South Carolina.
They came together to promote their common goals, their common purposes, mutual elevation, social advancement. But
the Society's members were craftsmen and tradesmen. Many of their clients were white slave owners, and some chose to buy slaves for themselves. But their motives were complex.
We can't shy away from the fact that you had free Blacks that owned slaves and used them in the same way that whites did. But we also know that you had people who were free who were, quote unquote, married to a slave spouse. And what they might do is purchase the enslaved spouse, but now the law would not allow them to emancipate the person. And so they end up holding the individual who was really their husband or wife as a slave.
Why didn't they challenge the status quo?
They didn't challenge the status quo because they understood how precarious their freedom was.
Try to imagine having to purchase your own spouse. That was the reality for some free Black people in the South. They existed on the margins of the largest slave society in the history of the world. The white planters who stood above them were making more money than any other group in America. They set the political course of our nation by controlling its wealth, crafting a new landscape with new centers of power. Like Natchez, Mississippi. In 1800, this was a trading post. 50 years later, there were more millionaires here per capita than anywhere else in America. And in their day, money flowed from a place just nearby. This is called Forks of the Road. It's the dividing point on a rural highway right outside Natchez. It may look like a sleepy intersection, but this was once the second largest slave market in the United States, a place where Black people from the Upper South were brought to be sold into the Deep South.
This was a specialty market. You know, you go to certain places and you know where you can get what you want. That was this place. If you wanted a field hand, you can find them here. If you wanted somebody with more technical skills, you can find them here. Builders, carpenters, any and everything you were looking for.
This is like a shopping center.
What it was like going to Costco or Walmart. But the product that was being sold
were human beings. Tens of thousands of slaves were sold at Forks of the Road. And the planters who bought them weren't just buying workers for their cotton fields. They had a very specific interest in women.
You wanted men for the heavy labor, and you particularly may have had an interest in females for their ability to reproduce the next generation of enslaved people for your particular plantation.
The high cost of purchasing even a single slave meant that most masters tried to breed their own labor force. And some went to great lengths to make it happen, from forced pairings of slave couples to rape. Of all the major slave societies in the New World, only in the United States did the slave population naturally increase over time. The 400,000 people that we imported from Africa had become nearly 4 million by the outbreak of the Civil War. The numbers are staggering, and so was the violence required to keep them all under control. This small museum in Walterboro, South Carolina, holds evidence of that violence. Objects that seem to come from the Middle Ages.
Oh man, look at that.
Yeah, for the neck.
No whip.
They would pour salt in the wounds of people after they'd been whipped.
Yeah.
Men, women, children whipped.
Slave muzzle.
What had that person said? Why was that person being muzzled? You know, what always strikes me when I look at items like this, probably some enslaved blacksmith created these items.
You had to make the instruments for your own oppression.
Exactly.
What choice did you have?
The shackles.
You have all of these implements of torture, which are tools for punishing people, right, who don't do what they're supposed to do. But they're also symbolic, right? So if you see someone muzzled or whipped in your community, you're warned what not to do. It creates this pervasive sense of fear and terror. Slavery doesn't have to mean that you're whipped every day, you're raped every day, that you're tortured every day, to be incredibly destructive to one's spirit and soul and being. You just have to commit such shocking violence upon the bodies of a few examples that nobody else would dare to think about it. Now, the funny thing is, people still do dare, right? Right? You still do have people saying, like, well, you know, whatever they got, it's got to be better than this.
I just want to close with this. John Wayne, the Duke. They recalled the Duke on display in a 1971 Playboy interview, the one who said, "I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to the point of responsibility." And regarding Indians, our so-called stealing of this country from them was a simple matter of survival. There were great numbers of people who needed new land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. Okay, Lauren, we can open for discussion.
Okay, if anyone has a question or comment, you can raise your hand and we will call on you. As many times as I see this presentation, it's still just shocking. Howard, do you have something? We'll just get you unmuted.
I had unmuted myself. Okay.
There we go.
About the French of Vietnam, the first Vietnam, and the second real Vietnam. What should have kept the French out of Vietnam was the 1,000 years that the Vietnamese fought the Chinese. Okay, they didn't listen to that, and the Americans didn't listen to the 1,000 years of Chinese and the almost 100 years of French. That should have kept us out, but it didn't. Now, if Jefferson said that, if he really said that he hoped to learn something about personal relations from Native Americans, that's got to be one of the world's biggest ironies that I have ever heard of. And when whoever had said that Native Americans now belong to the Great Father in DC, is that the first indication of slavery and people as property in the history of the United States before slaves came?
No. They had defined slaves as property in, I believe it's 1740.
Right.
It's before the Revolution that slaves are defined as property. What you had was a case, the John Punch case. And what happens is the white indentured slaves and the black slaves were housed together. Then two white guys, one black guy, they run away, they escape, they get captured, and then they're brought back, and the two white guys who ran away go before the court for escaping, but the black guy is handed back to the owner, no court, because he's property.
Okay, so when he said the Native Americans belong to the Great White Father, what did that mean?
Oh, it was, you're on lands that your father has now come along, and we're going to tell you what to do. I am now your Great White Father. And by the way, Andrew Jackson uses that frequently in talking about the natives, is that, they're doing this for their interests. We are going to massacre your villages, and it's in your interest that we do.
Thank you.
I mean, what I think is important. This is just another iteration of people saying things that have no correlation with reality. It is, and the all of which is in service of getting ever greater wealth, power, and greed. And these are just other iterations. It's like we look at World War II as something unique. We look at Hitler's Holocaust as being unique. They're not. These are things that have been going on from the time that we hit the Neolithic period and we discovered agriculture. And with that, we discovered property, possessions, greed, power, wealth. Yes.
Thank you.
And just another point on that, Ralph, if you'll go ahead and unmute, but I'll just finish my point quickly, is just that when we keep having wars for us kind of defined, well, we got to get Saddam Hussein out because he's a brutal dictator. No, that's not why you're doing it. It's just another iteration of greed, wanting to get a hold of things that will add to wealth and power. Putin, he has to go and invade Ukraine because there's Russian citizens there. Nonsense. You're going because of power and greed. Go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah, hey, good morning. Really enjoy the class. It's been a long time since I heard the doctrine of discovery talked about some, and I don't think we got any of that in my grade school, high school years. But interestingly, I have a former work colleague who worked for the environmental agency in Mississippi. He has property in Mississippi along the Alabama line down to the south part of the state, maybe 80 miles north of Mobile, we'll say. And because this huge property has been in his family for generations, all the way back, he actually has a crumbling piece of paper that he had the good sense to have scanned years ago. The document is it's the first piece of paper that says his family was deeded the land by the King of Spain. Then he has another document from the government of France, at which time the monarchy proclaimed that all land grants given during the time of the Spanish ownership would be honored. So he has that document. Then he has another document from post 1803 by the American government that says that all land grants granted by the French during their ownership shall be honored. So he has an American document that says he owned it. And then from then he has the usual things issued by state and later county authorities. But he's the only person I've ever even heard of who, I'm sure there are others in the South, who can demonstrate land ownership for in excess of what is that, 300 years? It's astonishing. But of course, he saw these documents when he was a kid, and he figured out then that what he was taught in school was, you know, we think we own the land, but he finds arrowheads. He finds Native American artifacts on that property. He knows that there were people living there for thousands of years because he knows when the artifacts date from. And one of the most interesting things as an amateur, you know, arrowhead hunter and archaeologist, maybe myself, is they keep raising the estimates of exactly how many Native Americans lived on this continent. It's an enormous number, which of course makes the scale of the destruction by diseases, and then of course later by Europeans, it makes it even bigger. I mean, like, we showed up and just literally, and I'm talking literally here, this is not an exaggeration, millions of people got sick and died. Intentional or not, that is what happened. But boy, that doctrine of discovery, the price of that, you could really wrap it up that way.
Yeah, no, first, let me say this is the doctrine of discovery is fundamental to understanding America. It is what gave the Europeans the legal, moral, and spiritual foundation to invade and occupy these lands and to perpetrate genocide against the peoples who were here. Mind you, you're right. The estimates of the number of people has continuously changed. It is, you know, when I was a kid in, you know, high school, right? I thought there might have been like 10 or 20 Indians here, right? I mean, there weren't that many of them, right? The latest count that I had last time I looked, you know, historians keep coming up and modifying the number based on evidence.
Exactly.
The last was 140 million people. All of them did not die because of diseases.
Yeah.
They were slaughtered. And
yeah,
so, you know, it's one of the things is, it's like, I'm sure it is there someplace. I haven't found it, but I'm confident some historian is going to find an ancestor of Ron DeSantis who equated the doctrine of discovery with critical race theory, and it's outlawed. Yeah. Don't say doctrine of discovery. Don't say gay. I mean, this is how American history was so bastardized over all those years. Yeah. And I'm convinced that if we cannot confront the truth, we will never survive. We will kill ourselves rather than face the truth. America is one huge alcoholic family living in denial. That's what it is.
Yeah, it is. Ugh.
I don't drink.
It will help. Pick it up. Try it.
Well, yeah, I think you're taking it up before the election. You rather casually commented on the early end of international slave trade here, and then went on. And it seemed to me, how could that be so easy to do in a country like this?
To end the international slave trade?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the people who were in power, right, at the time of writing the Constitution, there was a fight. There was a fierce fight to get rid of slavery. And Pierce Butler, the largest slaveholder in America at that time, in South Carolina, whose overseer, it was Roswell King. If you want to go to dinner tonight, go up to Roswell, which is named after Roswell King, who was an overseer for the largest slaveholder. And so Pierce Butler said, if you try to get rid of slavery, we can start the Civil War now. Patrick Henry, who we all know as give me liberty or give me death. That's the frame put around Patrick Henry. And we all think of what a glorious, what a courageous guy. He believed so much in liberty and freedom. He was willing to die for it. Another huge slave owner who was a scurrilous human being. Thomas Jefferson hated him, by the way. And when it came time, when they were talking about the Continental Congress, trying to bring the colonists together to fight against England, they know the colonists don't want to join together. It's like, wait a minute, we don't want to get in a fight with England. You know, we're making money. We're here in South Carolina. We're doing well. Yeah, we don't like these taxes, but we're not willing to throw out the baby with the dirty water, you know, so, and they're like, everybody be cool, you know, and Madison's just trying to get them together to start the conversation. This is when Patrick Henry gets up and he demands we have to fight England. Give me liberty or give me death. James Madison tells that story to Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't there for that Continental Congress. And Thomas Jefferson says, so I guess we should all pray for Patrick Henry's death. Because it was, wait a minute, we're trying to get these guys together. And you can see this is a little known secret about the First Continental Congress, is that when Patrick Henry made that statement and James Madison thought this is going to drive the South Carolinians away and all of that, James Madison did a Woody Allen impersonation. And he said, well, he didn't mean that. He didn't mean that. Everyone relax. No, that's my Woody Allen impersonation. So it's just, you know, so what happens is they come to, we're going to keep slavery, but and not we're going to get rid of it in 1808, that no action can be taken against slavery for another 20 years. Well, over that time, over the 20 years, remember 1808, we have 1804 when we buy Louisiana, right? We've now had the experience that tobacco has depleted the soil of Virginia. Virginia is the largest slaveholder. So Jefferson sees the opportunity. He says, we'll end the international slave trade. Virginia will become the provider of slaves to the cotton plantation South.
And he had no contentious fighting?
No, the people in Virginia were all too happy because they had an oversupply now of slaves. They had transitioned out of tobacco into other things. They didn't need as many. So and if you go to the museum in Montgomery, to the Equal Justice Initiative museum there, they have a video display that shows the Black population leaving out of Virginia and Maryland and flooding into, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi.
Right.
I've tried to get a copy of that to show because it is very impressive. But really, my son going to school where they would teach the Walt Disney version of American history had a day where the students have to dress up, come to school, dress up like they were pioneers. Pioneers. There's no such thing as a pioneer. These people were murderers, rapists. Okay, so they come in dressed up as yeoman farmers. This is what settled the West. No, that's not what settled the West. If you want to show what settled the West is, you would have people in tattered clothes, in chains, the things around their neck, being led into the frontier. That's the reality of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Sal, what do we have coming up next week?
The railroads. The railroads, also a phenomenon of the cotton plantation South and a phenomenon of the technology developed in England to create steam. And what makes the railroad so important is its ability to take a product from inland and get it to the coast for shipping. Mind you, if you look at all of our, cities, they are along a waterway in some place. All of our, traditional old cities, they are ports, because what you had to do, that was it. When you went inland, if you may be able to, grow stuff or whatever, but if you can't get it to market, it's not all that important. But so the railroad becomes a very important factor in the cotton plantation South. And mind you, we talk about in the Walt Disney version of American history of heroism, of Davy Crockett, the Alamo, all that stuff. And what is really important is what were the things that were generating wealth and power. So the railroad became a major pillar of producing wealth and power. That's the story of America. It is about domination. It is about getting wealthy at any price, one of the things we did in the classes before is I said, oh, I am way over. I'm sorry. I know we're coming up. All right, I'll just finish this. Is what would you, if I have $500 million in my hand, what would you do to get it? What's the limit? And I would keep, escalating. Would you do this? Would you do that? Understand there are people who have no limit. Murder, enslavement, torture, there's no limit. And it's hard for us to believe that, but it is true. They didn't live just then, they live now too. Okay, I know we got another class coming up. I'm sorry, I rambled on too long. Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Sorry I messed up by pressing the wrong buttons.
We'll see you next week.
We'll see